Good evening. Welcome. My name is Katerji. This is the Katerji Show. Thank you so much for tuning in again. We've got a very special episode lined up for you today. We have got two guests. Sean couldn't join us on Tuesday, so he's here today on Thursday. But we've still got our booked-in guest, Luke Tryl, for More in Common. He's going to be talking to us about Labour's polling numbers, how things are going for the government after their first year in office. Not so well is the top line, but we're going to dive into that and find out the details with Luke Tryl shortly. And then later on in the evening, we've got Sean Pinner, obviously former British soldier, Mariupol Marine veteran, that survived the siege of Mariupol, was captured by Russia, and then was spent a significant period of time in captivity. Quite famously, he was sentenced to death by a Russian court. Now he's back. He's back in Ukraine, working here. So we're going to hear more about what he's up to today, and find out about that. So thanks so much for joining us again for another show. Hello, Liquid Amber. Hello to the regular guests that tune in. If you're following along for the first time, please do hit that follow button if you're watching on Twitch. And if you're watching on YouTube in catch up, please do like and subscribe. Really trying to grow the channel at the moment. So every little every little like helps, basically. So thank you so much for all of that. Now, without further ado, I'm going to bring our esteemed guest, Luke Tryl, Executive Director of More in Common, onto the show. Hang on, and I just need to unmute you. There you go, Luke. You should be... One second. There you go. You should be free to talk to our esteemed audience.
Good evening, everyone.
Hello. So, Luke, if you could please introduce yourself and let us know, a little bit about yourself and what you're doing, the work that More in Common are doing, and why we should be listening to you about the polls, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. My name is Luke Tryl. I am the UK Director of More in Common. And More in Common is an organisation that tries to get under the skin of public opinion, to look at what are the big sort of sentiments, fault lines, divides, and areas of convergence in public opinion. We have a particular interest in social cohesion, and what are the forces of polarization in society, but also looking at how that relates to people day to day, how they view politics, our institutions, and in particular their relationship with the government. And we do regular focus groups and polling, both of attitudes to big issues, whether it's climate change or migration, but also to the performance of the government and indeed the other political parties. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about what we've seen from Labour over the past year today.
Yeah, oh, hang on one second. Yeah, that sounds really fantastic, Luke. So look, Labour have been in office for a year. I think judging them before a year seemed a bit unfair, given the amount of work that they've had to do. They've been in office for a year now. Some of it they've had some success with, but look, they're having a lot of negative coverage at the moment. They seem to be lurching from one internal crisis to another, making very unpopular decisions, but more importantly, from my perspective, not really having a story to justify those decisions. And then when having to reverse those decisions, they look like they don't know what they're doing. Personally speaking, I think the winter fuel payment thing, which was deeply unpopular, I think I really supported it. I really think that we need to start having a serious look at the amount of money we're giving to retirees, because there are a lot of them that don't need it. They are the wealthiest class of people in the country by a country mile. And because of that, we need to reallocate those resources that might not be needed, for richer pensioners. But it was such a toxically received policy that they weren't able to defend, and then they reversed back on some of it. Now, so you could be a retiree and earning 35,000 a year, which is more than some people are earning on a full-time wage, and still be entitled to a winter fuel allowance, which, personally speaking, is absurd. But this is the position that we're in, and it hasn't been it hasn't been a very successful storytelling exercise for Labour, let alone with regards to policy. So how are the polls reacting to these kinds of things?
Yeah, well, I think if the public were giving Labour a report card for their first year in office, it would be that famous teacher's quote, "must try harder," going forward. What we've seen from Labour is obviously they won that landslide majority last year, very big, close to Blair's majority, but it was actually on a reasonably low share of the vote. They only got around 35% of the vote. And what's happened since then is that they have steadily dropped back down. In our latest poll out today, they're on 25%. That's about average across the pollsters, so it's not a particular outlier. Keir Starmer's personal approval ratings have taken an even bigger hit. You know, Keir Starmer was never particularly popular, but people were sort of begrudgingly, against the alternative, which was a continuation of the chaos of the Tory government. He looked sober and sensible. He's dropped from a sort of plus 11 positive approval rating when he came in. That's now down at around minus 40, bobbing around there today. So a big drop for him personally as well. And I think, when you talk to the public in focus groups, or you look at the polling, I think a couple of things really jump out which have driven this. One is just the public are really impatient for change. There is a feeling that there is too much in Britain that doesn't work at the moment, that things are too expensive, that the NHS, which many Britons are very proud of, isn't working in the way that it should, and they don't think Labour have moved quickly enough, fairly or not. I think the second area, and you alluded to one of them, is just some of those policy decisions have really jarred with the public. Now, it's not that Labour haven't done popular things, and I say this all the time. So if you look at some of the stuff Angela Rayner has done around workers' rights, around renters' rights, she's the Deputy Prime Minister. If you look at measures to take on water companies that put sewage into rivers, the minimum wage, all popular. But they've been drowned out by what I call the quadrant of doom policies. So that is the winter fuel allowance, which you alluded to. And it's interesting on the winter fuel allowance because most of the public agree with what you were just saying, Oz, that actually, the wealthiest pensioners shouldn't get it. I think they made a mistake putting it so low, the threshold at 12 grand, and actually you could have got somewhere in between where it's gone up to now, which, as you say, is quite high relative incomes, and where the public might have got it. But it was also the fact it was announced into a vacuum. It was almost the very first thing they did before a budget, and it came to define them. You've got that, and then you've got the proposed reforms to disability benefits, which have now been very watered down. Again, if you look at the public, they broadly agree that we need to do more to get people on benefits into work and to try and bring down some of the costs. But when it came to PIP, which is a specific disability benefit, I was talking to people who'd say, I know someone who needs that. They need that benefit. And so that was unpopular as well. And then the other group, which has attracted some unpopularity, is farmers. So putting inheritance tax on some farms, that's been unpopular with some people. So I think that has driven down unpopularity. And then there's a third thing. And oddly enough, I think this might be the most dangerous long term, is that last week, when there was that rebellion around disability benefit cuts, there was a sense that perhaps Keir Starmer was losing control of the Labour Party. And one of the things we know, which I said earlier, is one of the reasons people so desperately wanted rid of the Tories was they were so fed up of that merry-go-round of new Prime Minister every 4 weeks. They can't control the backbenchers. It's all about them. Interestingly, we're now in a position where Labour have overtaken the Conservative Party on who is seen as more divided. And I think that is a real risk they need to get control. So I think those three factors, and I think you're spot on. I think they come together under what is the purpose of this government? What is the point of it, right? Starmer, eschews having an ideology or Starmerism, which is fine, but you've got to take the public on a journey. They can't think it's just more of the same.
Yeah, that's been a real problem. There's been a real problem in the storytelling element. Like it's not just governing. You have to be able to govern and explain why you're making the decisions that you've been able to make. And we haven't really had much of that happen from this government. And it's been a real problem. But look, we'll go more into Labour's woes, but one of the other headline stories, apart from the other one, which we all know what that is, we'll get to it. But the Conservatives haven't capitalised on this. In fact, they are continuing to sink further and further into the polls, while CCHQ says everything's going fine and swimmingly. Kemi Badenoch doesn't seem to have a clue what she's doing. So what's going on with the Tories? Why aren't the Tories sweeping up those votes from disgruntled people who aren't happy with the Labour government?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think one is that ordinarily, in an ordinary political cycle, what you expect is, for the first year at least, if not longer, the opposition that's just been beaten out of government to go away and lick its wounds for a bit. Because to be quite frank, the public don't want to hear from you. They don't want to hear from Tories who had 14 years in office, because everything the Tories complain about, the public can go, well, you guys were there for quite a long time. Couldn't you have done something about it? And we hear that a lot in focus groups. So I think that's part of it. They're almost in some ways a victim of Labour having become unpopular quite quickly. But I think the second thing, and it links on to the big story we will go on to talk about, is they're struggling for airtime. So it's interesting. Sometimes I play clips of Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, to focus groups, and people will say, "Oh, I quite like it. She's quite punchy. She looks like she tells the truth." But it's the first time they've seen a clip of Kemi Badenoch, right? So they are just not getting through. I will often do focus groups where I start and say, does anyone know who the leader of the Conservatives is? And 2-3 people will put their hand up. So I think there is a big cut-through challenge going on. And part of that is because you've got this challenger party on the right in the form of Reform UK, which is sucking up so much of the oxygen. And it is difficult. One of the difficulties for the Conservatives is, if you look at that coalition that Boris Johnson won in 2019, it didn't just break in one direction. In previous year, 1997, Conservatives lose vote to Labour, return happens 2010. What you had was a total fragmentation of that vote. Some went to Labour, the Lib Dems, some stayed at home, some went to Reform. So actually, there's a more existential question for the Conservatives, which I don't think they've got an answer to yet, which is, which way do I turn? And I think, as we know, there is a danger that you end up in a situation where you end up pleasing no one as well. So I think they're driving the Conservatives down. Say in our latest poll today, the Conservatives are on 19%, which, if you think about, the most successful election-winning machine, arguably in the Western world, now being on 19%, just shows quite how perilous their situation is.
Well, look, as a Labour voter and a Labour supporter, and it's quite a strange thing for me to be even saying that, because a few years ago I absolutely could never have imagined myself joining the Labour Party, and now here I am with this Prime Minister who seems to be making a lot of mistakes here and there. By his own admission, he has said he is a lot of mistakes for just a year in office, but part of the problem, as you're saying, is that Reform are sucking up all of this airtime. And I think we'll try and get into some of the specifics as to whether that's justified or not. But one of the problems that Keir Starmer has is he is in government, so everything he does is scrutinised, whereas Nigel Farage, as a populist, and this is what populists are very good at doing, all he has to do is complain, doesn't have to offer any strategies or solutions of his own, or explain how they would work, and yet he is still reaping the rewards of this dissatisfaction with politics in general, that has, really the fault lines were erupted after Brexit, but we're still dealing with the fallout of that splintering in the traditional voting blocks that existed, I guess, before that referendum. So, talk us through the rise of reform. Is this something that we need to get used to now? Are Reform now the second party in the UK? I mean, I know before an election it's weird to say that, but there was a brief moment during the Brexit before we'd actually left, in which the Liberal Democrats were sweeping up all of these votes when Corbyn wasn't. And we had that brief moment where we were saying, are we talking about the Liberal Democrats now? And that's a long time ago. But again, I think we should come to their Lib Dems separately after this. But Reform, what's going on with Reform? Why are they doing so well in the polls?
It's a really good question. So I think there's a couple of things going on. So they took around 15% of the vote in the last election, and that was largely disgruntled Conservatives who were particularly unhappy about the party's record on migration, and also some personal support for Nigel Farage. What's happened since then, if you look at the polling, is that their support has basically doubled. So they've gone from 15% to 29% in our poll this week. And that extra 15% of voters that they've won over are quite interesting. So if you think of the first group as kind of what you might call, the sort of Reform diehards, they like Nigel Farage, they're very anti-migration, they're fully signed up. The second group of Reform voters are what I call roll the dice voters. They are
the Boris Johnson coalition voters who may have voted for Sir Keir Starmer the last time around.
Exactly. They're basically a group of voters who sort of went, 2016, I vote for Brexit because I want change. Some of them actually vote for Corbyn in that 2017 surge because they're fed up of austerity and want change. Boris Johnson, 2019, Keir Starmer, 2024. They basically keep pressing the change button or rolling the dice on something new, and they're not getting it. And I think for that group of voters, Labour's early stumbles have made them think, actually, we need to try something new entirely. That is very much what I hear in focus groups. It's not even, and I think this is really important, that they're fully signed up members of the Farage fan club. In fact, some of them say he might turn out to be just as bad as the rest of them, but we may as well give him a try because he seems a bit different at the moment. They're not the hyper enthusiastic ones. In fact, the biggest swing to Reform, when we looked at our polling a couple of months ago, looking at generations and gender, it was Gen X women. So women approaching retirement age had the biggest swing to Reform since the election. And that was because, that you chat to folks, it's just said too much isn't working. We can't go on as we are. And I don't want to get too existential at 7:45 on a Thursday night, but just this sense of the social contract, it doesn't feel like it's working for people. And so I think that is turbocharging it. And as you say, that the test for Reform is not the same as a test for being in government like Labour, or a test for having been in government like the Conservatives. It is simply the ability to be seen to offer an alternative.
So I feel like we're rolling through the parties, but I do think we should talk about these different blocks because they exist in a way that we only really ever needed to talk about Labour and the Conservatives when I was growing up. And then the Liberal Democrats were for people who didn't fit between those two. Then we had an insurgent party basically in Scotland take over a huge amount of seats, the SNP. They fell away in recent years because of, they've been in charge for a long time. Scotland has its own dynamics that I think we probably shouldn't try and focus too much on at this moment because it's probably not a question for now. It's a question for several years' time. But the Liberal Democrats have been hoovering up votes from, polling numbers at least, from dissatisfied Labour voters, but also Conservatives. The harder Conservatives swing to the right to try and chase reform, the more that One Nation Conservative bloc, the very eco-minded people, National Trust members kind of thing, are trying to find alternatives. And the Liberal Democrats have done really well in establishing themselves as a natural home for those kinds of people who don't want to go to the Greens. And we'll talk about the Greens and the left after the Liberal Democrats. But have the Liberal Democrats reached a ceiling? Because pitching themselves as potential, not the government in waiting, but as potential main opposition to Farage, when you look at the numbers, that's not beyond the realms of possibility. So where are the Liberal Democrats in all of this? And again, have they reached a ceiling, given that they sort of sit between Labour and Conservative, and therefore aren't swinging towards the populist kind of sides that are at the moment really putting pressure on Labour from the flanks?
Well, look, I mean, there's no doubt the Liberal Democrats had a very good election result last year. In fact, a record election results, getting the 72 seats that they did. As you say, lots of those areas that we would once have considered diehard Tory land, Oxfordshire, where David Cameron's seat was, parts of places like Chichester, the former Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan's seat falling, these kind of affluent, kind of Middle England areas falling to the Liberal Democrats. So a very good result, which continued in this year's local elections, where in some areas they basically, places like Kent and Devon, they acted as a pincer movement with Reform on the Tories. So you had them losing seats to Lib Dems on the left and Reform on the right and getting totally squeezed. The challenge, though, and you alluded to this, is their vote is quite concentrated. It's why they won way more seats than Reform did on a smaller share of the vote in the election, basically benefiting from tactical voting against the Conservatives. And what that means is there are actually very few seats where they're in a decent second now and could look to go up. I mean, it does look like they've got a ceiling somewhere around 100. And part of that as well is, if you remember, some viewers might remember that, the Liberal Democrats of the 2000s used to win a lot of seats off Labour. Remember, after the invasion of Iraq, they were winning seats like Hornsey and Wood Green in North London, seats in Birmingham as well. They are no longer competitive in those Labour seats. And so if the Liberal Democrats want to do their next tranche, they've got to turn themselves from being the party of, sort of sensible localists who are disappointed with the Tories into a party that can challenge Labour on its left flank. And that is difficult. So at the moment, I find it hard to see where the Liberal Democrat growth is, but we are in volatile political times.
So now on to my favourite subject in British politics, the left flank. The Greens have been also hoovering up those votes. But actually, looking at the polls, they haven't really shifted a huge amount. You'd think they'd be doing better with disaffected Labour voters than they have been. Farage will be the much happier of the two, of those two sort of upstart parties. But there's news for the Greens. They are having a leadership contest. Zach Polanski, populist leader who once offered his services hypnotizing women to make their breasts larger. That's been a bit of a scandal that he's had to deal with. He blames the Sun for it, for putting words in his mouth. And I don't know that stacks up. But again, I don't think that's going to put off many of the people that are potentially looking to vote for the Greens, because what he is offering is Corbynism Mark II, a populist movement, left populist movement with eco credentials, banging on some of the same drums of wanting to leave NATO, etc. And he is sweeping up support from some of Corbyn's previous backers. However, we've had a new piece of news in the last couple of weeks, in that Jeremy Corbyn and his alliance of, I'm not necessarily sure that all of those people that he is in his independence alliance with can be described as left wing. judging by some of the policies that they've voted for in Parliament already. But again, you don't have to scrutinise the independent group. But Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana are apparently setting up a new party, or that's what Zara Sultana said, and Jeremy Corbyn's response was less enthusiastic than Zara made it out to be. So what does that mean for the Greens with this eco-populist movement? Will they try and build a sort of green-red alliance between Corbyn and, I mean, that's harder to predict. But the question I'm asking really is, can these two populist left movements exist in competition to each other, or will one win out in the end? And what does this mean for Labour? Because before the left really had nowhere else to go. That was traditionally a problem for the left in the country. They were trying to influence Labour's policy. Following the expulsion of Jeremy Corbyn, that has acted as a bit of a lightning rod for people to rally around. And his supporters are very enthusiastic, and they want him to present an alternative. And they're very excited at the prospect of getting maybe 10% of the vote. Which again will mean nothing with regards to governance, but UKIP and the Brexit Party and Now Reform didn't really care about governance in any of their reasons for standing either. But it is a headache for Labour. It is bad news for Labour losing votes to a populist left party. How are the polls? How are the focus groups reacting to this potential Corbyn Zara Sultana party? And can the Greens coexist with this party, or will they need to do some sort of agreement to make it work? Because again, some of those Green voters are disaffected Tories, and it doesn't sound like they're going to go along with the whole Zach Polanski eco-populism thing. So we've got a bit of a moment coming for the left in the country that they need to come to grips with.
Yeah, and it is the question of the moment. I mean, just starting with the Greens, because I think it's useful to go there. If you look at the Greens won 4 seats at the election, they won 2 in what you might call kind of eco-left style seats, or where that was had more of an appeal. So in Bristol Central, which was a new seat they won, and Brighton Pavilion, which Caroline Lucas had held previously. But then they won these 2 former Tory seats, so in Waveney Valley and in Herefordshire as well, which, very different style of seat. And there was basically a choice for the Greens. Were they going to tilt more towards that kind of eco-conservationism or more towards eco-socialism? Now, if you actually look at the parliamentary maths or the electoral maths, the Greens are actually second in far more kind of inner city, studenty, Labour-facing seats. And to me, it was kind of always obvious that was the direction they were going to have to try and tilt in. And to be honest, until now, I had been quite surprised that the Greens weren't hoovering up more of the sort of disaffected left votes. They've taken some from Labour, but actually, a chunk have gone to the Liberal Democrats. Chunk said that they're not going to vote. And I think that is what has motivated this Polanski pitch, this, we can properly become eco-socialist populists and challenge Labour on the left. You then, as you say, though, get this fly in the ointment for them potentially, which is the new Corbyn-led, maybe Sultana-led party as well, depending on where they get to in their discussions. We actually, as it happened, polled on this slightly before it became more of a reality. And what we found was that, and this is hypothetical polling, so I just really want to stress this can totally change once things go in. It took 10% of the vote. And it took, of that 10%, it took another 3% from Labour. So it actually extended Reform's lead, I think, in that poll from 4 to 7 points. So, tricky for Labour, definitely a problem, as you say. But it also basically halved the Green vote. The Greens dropped from 9, I think, down to 5 in that poll. So what was clearly happening was, yes, they were taking some more votes from the centre-left party Labour, but they were really cannibalising the left vote. And it would be it makes me think that if this party comes into being and is successful, there will be no option for the Greens but to go into some kind of red-green relationship with them, because there isn't the space for both of them to do well. You add into that, of course, you've got this third dimension, which is the so-called Gaza independents, who did very well in some heavily Muslim areas of the country, around Birmingham, in Dewsbury as well. And that is another threat to Labour on the left, which doesn't seem to have let up yet. We've seen some council by-elections where in wards which have a high Muslim population swinging to these independents. So you've basically got these three challenges. And I think the big question over the next year is, can those three distinct groups coalesce into a force on the left? And then, and I think this is the really interesting one, we're a long way from an election. Let us imagine we are in 2029 and it is a choice basically between re-elect this Starmer government or it's Nigel Farage's party who gets in. What do those voters do? What do those people who've gone to the Lib Dems, to the Greens, to a Corbyn party do? Do they say, I'm going to hold my nose and I'm going to vote for Keir Starmer, a bit like lots of Liberal Conservatives did in 2019, faced with Jeremy Corbyn? Or do they go, I'm so disillusioned, I don't care, I'm voting for these parties? And I think over the course of this parliament, that is going to be a central question.
I mean, yeah, I think one of the central questions that I posed at the start of all of this, because again, I could see how difficult the economic situation was. We all could, that they were going to have to make some really unpopular decisions fast. But one of the questions that I said at the start of this was, if this government is to win a second term, it will be based on the strength of the economy. That'll be the big driving thing. And not, for me, not immigration. Again, I might be wrong. Maybe you can give us your perspective on this. But where the economy is, do people feel better off than they did before? Will public services be working to a good extent? A lot of this is based on growth. The Labour Party pitched themselves not only as going to be more fair with the NHS and so on than the Conservatives, but they were going to grow the economy. And they have not managed to do that in the way that they were hoping to do. And so much of their sorting out public services relies on them successfully growing the economy. So, what are the struggles that Labour has now between now and, it's still a long way away. I think we tend to, because politics is a daily kind of coverage thing for us, we tend to forget the fact that a general election 4 years away is going to be so very different. COVID, we'd never even heard of COVID in 2018. We wouldn't have predicted that it was going to have such an impact on the economy and the way people lived and the way people think about politics, and it came out of the blue. So we could have a situation happening in a year or two's time that really changes the situation for Starmer. But the economy is still the big thing that Labour really needs to get to grips with to have any success, surely.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And just on that point about unpredictability, I mean, very often I'm speaking purely to sort of British domestic audiences. This is a global audience, so you will have parallels from around the world with how quickly the political weather changes. Look at Canada, look at Australia, where people had written off centre-left governments and they got re-elected. We are in an era of very short cycles, and one of around the anniversary, a few people asked me, can Labour turn it around? I was like, of course they can turn it around, but some things have to go right for them. And the biggest of them all is that people have to feel better off. It's about living standards. Now, obviously, you might call that growth. For lots of people, growth, it's a difficult concept to, understand and relate to. And certainly lots of people think, when you mean growth, do you just mean in London and the city? And not for me. Living standards, I think, are so important, both, at the kind of big level, can I deal with energy bills? Can I pay my mortgage? But also, I think one of the things which people miss is that the big frustration about the cost of living crisis for lots of people, obviously those who've had to choose between heating or eating are the most impacted, but the group just above that, the group who are getting by, but say, again, there was a woman we spoke to in a focus group recently who said, I can't even treat myself to fish and chips every now and again. I'm, people who say I'm just working to live, living to work. Again, I spoke to someone in Runcorn after there was a by-election that Reform won up there, and in that focus group, she told us that she was approaching retirement. She thought she'd be slowing down. She was still doing shifts. She was still felt she was surviving rather than living. And that is the central challenge for Labour. Tackle that, make it feel like the country works, particularly around the NHS. Now, look, I'm not someone, if you look at it, I don't think migration doesn't matter. I think Labour have to show competence and control on it, particularly around channel crossings, show they're making progress. But that is dwarfed by, and it has been on our issue tracker for a while, is the cost of living. Cost of living and NHS are the top two issues for people. And, I should say on the NHS, we've seen some, in some of the focus groups, sign things are getting better. That, Wes Streeting, who is the health secretary, widely seen as one of Labour's kind of stars, and, seems to be a good job. Obviously, he's now got potential strikes to contend with, which might set all of that back. But the NHS, the economy, and as I say, showing competence and control on migration. Labour are never going to be able to outbid Reform on migration, and I don't think that they should try, but just showing they can run it competently. And then there's another thing, because it goes back to what you said earlier, that sort of sense of purpose and direction for the government. If you looked at the last election, the number 3 issue after the NHS and cost of living for Labour and Liberal Democrat voters was tackling climate change and the green transition. And I think if Labour are going to keep their progressive flank on side, but also, Labour loyalists too, I think showing progress on that matters and using that as a peg to talk about their wider economic message. So things like good jobs, things like, obviously very relevant to you, the number of people who I speak to in focus groups who say, well, we need to do renewables now, so we're not dependent on madmen like Putin anymore for our energy. So energy security, jobs, growth, living standards, using the green agenda for part of that. And Ed Miliband, the energy secretary, is obviously a very experienced minister and seems to have been one of the ministers who got to grips with the machinery of government more quickly than others, having done it before.
Now, one of the things, obviously, the big one, and it's where Reform are getting the most success, is talking about immigration. We've touched on it. I have quite a very strong liberal perspective on immigration. I think losing free movement of people was a tragedy. I think we should vastly increase the amount of refugees we allow into the country, and I think we can do all of that. But also, and this is what sets me apart from, I think, some of my friends and allies on the left on this issue, and what sets apart, your Zach Polanski's and your Jeremy Corbyn's and your Zara Sultanas from not just where the Labour Party is, but where the rest of the country is that small boat crossings need to stop. That's the idea. My coming through to it on that position isn't that I don't want people arriving, it's that I don't want people arriving on dangerous small vessels that endanger their lives. I think that needs to stop, and we need to find a way of ending that fairly, that isn't going to endanger more migrant lives. And that's a difficult one. It's a very, very difficult topic to talk about, even within people's who are overtly, explicitly pro-migration and support having more refugees, admitting more refugees into the country. But those boat crossings are a problem. They're a problem for Labour. They're a problem for the Conservatives. The Conservatives didn't know how to deal with it. They tried to talk a very strong anti-migrant game, whereas courts and various things, they weren't able to implement the kinds of draconian, I would say cruel and inhumane policies they were discussing trying to implement. Labour are trying a different approach, which is, rather than burning our relationship down with our European partners, are trying to work with the French to try and stop it. We've seen the results of some of that. We've seen police puncturing boats before they set off, so that people can't get on there, not puncturing the boats while they're afloat in the ocean, as we saw happening in Greece. But again, I've seen that draw a lot of criticism from the left of the party, and it feels like Labour are kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't situation. You know, if they do what the country wants, and I have to bear in mind this is not me saying this. This is what the country. This is what your polling shows. What every polling shows, that the country wants the boats to stop. And if Labour does stop the boats, the only way to stop that boats are maybe there are some carrots, maybe there are some sticks, but it requires stopping people from making that journey, and doing that will trigger a backlash from people who don't think that that's the right approach. So it's a very difficult, tightrope for Labour to walk on. What's your sense on this? Again, I think that Labour need to be advancing a positive case for immigration. But we're talking about 5% of immigrants arriving in this country, but they're talked about 95% of the time. So really, what does Labour do on this issue? How does it approach this issue with in mind that it wants to stay in government, it wants to keep trying to help deal with this issue rather than kicking the can to a reform government that will be far more cruel? This is one of the worries that I have about this left flank party, is if we're saying, okay, fine, we hate Labour so much that we're going to see a reform government brought in, the things that you're arguing for and the things that you're saying you need to not vote Labour for are going to be so much worse if you vote for a party that isn't doing what Labour's doing, which was coming in and again, I don't think it would be unfair to not praise Labour for coming in and doing away with those cruel, Rwanda-style policies that the Tories were trying to push in. But they've taken no credit for that whatsoever. It just seemed to be a given. And the danger of a reform government coming in seems to be lost in this sort of discussion about what Labour needs to be doing to win back its left. Immigration, how does Labour deal with that, Luke?
Well, that is a big question. So the one thing to say is, look, I think the part of the problem with this debate is it gets stuck in kind of caricatures. Most Brits are not against providing a level of support to people in genuine need. And you only have to look at how popular the Homes for Ukraine scheme is to see that, right across the board, Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat.
But also it was those numbers and the people coming from Hong Kong and Ukraine, all those numbers were thrown together and the Tories were like, and that's what Farage has been saying, look, we've had record numbers. And I'm like, you're talking about Ukrainians and Hong Kongers that the public, by and large, wanted to allow into the country.
And interpreters from Afghanistan, people that helped the UK, they're very much this group. I think the issue with the reason that small boats, and I've done a lot of opinion research into attitudes to channel crossings and small boats, the reason that it is such an issue is that for many Brits, firstly, the channel holds such a special place in the British psyche. Secondly, that it just goes against that fundamental, when I talk to people, principle of fairness. People say, well, isn't it like sort of queue jumping almost? It doesn't get there. And third, it goes, there is a reason that the Brexit slogan, take back control, was so successful, because control really matters to people. And again, channel crossings rub up against that sense of control. And so as a result, as you say, almost the whole migration debate, even if people want overall numbers to go down, becomes dominated by the channel crossings. And then the final point as well that's so powerful is just the imagery, right? They make for an image and it sticks with in people's minds. So I think that the flip side to that, though, is that I sense when I talk to public, they're not in the mood for further gimmicks, right? They're not in the mood for things which just aren't going to work. They want a pragmatic solution to stop the crossings, to find ways that we can help people in genuine need, but so that we can control the borders.
But Farage isn't offering any of those solutions, right? And he's the one that's reaping all of the rewards from, and this has been the whole Farage's whole thing from the start. Brexit wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for immigration being a policy that he could just press that immigration button and piss people off enough to start voting in a way that he wants them to. And you know, the catastrophe of what Brexit has done for our economy hasn't made people go, wow, Farage didn't know what he was talking about. It's made people go, oh, maybe Farage should be running the country because he certainly has the right ideas. And it's is exasperating as a left of centre kind of voter because everything seems to be going wrong. And, one of the things that the metrics that I pay attention to, and maybe it's a silly thing to pay attention to, but every post that Keir Starmer makes on Twitter is just inundated with people telling him that how much they hate him. And again, I don't remember that being the case for Rishi Sunak or others. And again, we're talking about Twitter that's become a bit of a information cesspool under Elon Musk, so that shouldn't be read too much into it. But he looks like an unpopular man. He looks like a man who's struggling to meet the moment. And once people have that impression of you in their mind, it's very difficult to get around it. David Cameron didn't have to be massively popular to win votes in the UK. He just had to be competent. Starmer is struggling to look competent, right? That's the truth, right?
Yeah, and I think, look, in our data, if there were one thing, and I alluded to this earlier, which would worry Keir Starmer down, it was that sense that he's not in control anymore. To go back to that control question, so a majority saying he's not in control of the party, in general saying the government doesn't have things under control. If that image sets, that becomes more difficult to shift, even if the fundamentals improve, right? And we've talked about elections where the centre-left have turned it round. The flip side is if you look to the US, where lots of the fundamentals were improving, but an image of the Biden administration in general had set in, but also people weren't feeling it enough in their day-to-day lives. So I think it is really difficult. And, of course, the other challenge for Keir Starmer is, that economic question that you identified, so much of it is out of his hands. It depends on what Donald Trump does. It depends on, China, Taiwan, what happens in the Middle East. There is a lot there. And I should say, the public generally give him higher marks for what he's done internationally than in the domestic arena. In fact, after the Oval Office meeting, when Starmer acted as a bit of a broker, he got a bump in his approval there. So he does get credit for some things, but I think it is hard for him. Next year, there are going to be elections in Scotland, elections in Wales, big, for the parliaments there, and big local elections, big test for both the Conservatives and Labour, and both of them could end up in a leadership contest if they don't go particularly well for the parties. Personally, I think the public would lose their rag at the idea of another change of prime minister, but we know what political parties are like.
Yeah, it's look, you've painted a really fascinating picture of where we really are with everything. I wish things were going better, not just because I'm a Labour voter, but also because I'm a patriot. I passionately care about the state of our country, and I'm talking to my friends all the time. I'm obviously living in Ukraine at the moment, but for me, my quality of life is higher in Ukraine than it is in the United Kingdom. Yes, that has a lot to do with the fact that I have a European wage that I can spend in the poorest country in Europe, which goes a lot further than it does in the UK. A lot of my friends, in the people in the mid to late 30s now, for my age group, people who struggle, they don't have their own homes, they don't think they'll ever be able to get a mortgage, they're living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck. The situation, their paychecks aren't going up the way inflation is and the cost of living is, so it's a really difficult situation. And I don't blame my friends for looking at Labour and thinking, I want to vote for Jeremy Corbyn or whatever. I mean, I think they're wrong, but I don't blame them for it. So it's a really difficult position to be in. So look, final thoughts. If you've got any questions, guys, please feel free to add them. But we've had Luke for about an hour now, so I want to try and bring that to a conclusion. Final thoughts on where we are. I know we're 3-4 years away from pulling the trigger on a general election. But are there signs that Labour can look positively towards? Are there weaknesses in Farage's game that they can exploit? Give us some hope if you're a Labour voter hoping that Labour do see off the challenge of reform and the Tories.
Well, look, I mean, there are still big parts of reform and Nigel Farage's platform which limit their appeal to the public. And when we polled recently, Farage's relationship with Donald Trump was a big barrier to voting reform. In fact, Donald Trump's approval is underwater with every voter group in the UK, even reform voters now. Ukraine is they're on the wrong side of where the public are on that, but also some of the things around climate change as well. There's a danger of reform pitching themselves as a climate skeptic party. And I think for Labour, they do have time in government. Levers of government are powerful. And if we, let's look at 2012, George Osborne was being booed at the Olympics. Didn't look like that government could get re-elected. And then things turned around. So I would be a fool if I predicted anything. It would not surprise me if we got to the next election and, Starmer's still Prime Minister, another Labour leader is, Farage is, Kemi Badenoch is. At this stage, we just don't know.
So, listen, thanks so much, Luke. I've not seen any questions pop up there, but it's been really, really great to hear from you. It's been great to hear the polling, your focus groups, that kind of information that people might not be getting from their, regular newspaper or magazine. So really great to talk to you in depth about that. And hopefully you can come on in the future and tell us the state of play. Maybe things are improving. Is this your first Twitch stream, by the way?
It is. It's great.
There we go. So look, we're both reaching out to new audiences, trying to do something that maybe the Labour Party should be doing. I'm moving away from Twitter, trying to diversify my portfolio. But listen, thanks so much for joining us, Luke. Everyone, that was Luke Tryl from More in Common. If people want to know more about your work, Luke, what should they do? How should they find you?
Go to our website, which is moreincommon.org.uk.
One question I did have about because it's a global organisation, right? It's not just a UK-based organisation. So can you just tell us a little bit about the differences, what you guys focus on in the UK and what the more global operation is?
So, I mean, sometimes, and in fact, in lots of our conversation, we painted a bleak picture about the UK. Actually, compared to some of the other countries that we work in, the UK is far less polarized, certainly compared to the US, where there are big debates about even the fundamentals of democracy that we don't have over here. We also do work in France, in Germany, Poland, very highly polarized, as you will be well aware, and Brazil as well. So, we can become a bit gloomy in Britain sometimes, but actually the work we do in those other countries is in some ways much harder because it's harder to identify these areas of common ground.
Look, as someone who's spent the majority of my life now covering conflict zones, I very much, one of the struggles that I had during the Brexit referendum and is that I've been focusing a lot on Ukraine and their struggle for wanting to join Europe and seeing people being shot dead in the streets for that dream, for us to be turning around and throwing it away and saying we don't want anything to do. It was a tragedy to me personally speaking anyway, and it really does bring things into perspective when you have a more global approach. That just the UK isn't Misery Island really in comparison to some of those other places, even though it feels like it, and I know it does feel like it. But anyway, listen, thank you so much. That was Luke Tryl, More in Common Executive Director. We hope to have you back on the show. Thank you so much for joining us on the Katerji Show.
Thank you for having me.